Number 10. Poison. Somebody literally poisoned the water hole this time around. The Prohibition era was a time where there were restrictions placed on the consumption of alcohol, which was done so with a ban being placed on the production, importation, transportation, another Asian, you name it. Anything that has to do with alcohol, no go. This was all banned by the US government from 1920 to 1933. It's a long time with their twisted T's. Now, of course, this ban certainly did not stop people from producing or consuming alcohol, obviously. It was just done so in sneakier ways, right? Come in my basement, I got some, yeah, drink this, I don't know, whatever. The black market for alcohol was booming as people began to drink redistilled industrial alcohol instead of what they were getting before, which, I mean, as I said it, I'm like, this doesn't sound nice, does it? I'm not thirsty saying this out loud. This is all pretty well known, but one super sketchy thing is not. Something that the government agencies did to curb the black market sales of alcohol. It was, they literally poisoned the industrial alcohol that was being repurposed for drinking. Like, that's, yeah. And not just poison in a way where the consumer would get sick, which is already horrendous enough, but they poisoned the alcohol with lethal chemicals. It is thought that by the time the Prohibition ended, at least 10,000 people died from this alone. This event is still one of the strangest and deadliest decisions made by government officials. Cut to today, well, more and more things are now legal, so a little different in these 20s. Number 9, the man in the green hat. Congress had their own personal bootlegger. How nice must that have been? He was known as the man in the green hat. His name was George L. Cassidy. This was probably the weirdest job in history. It's up there. Cassiday's 9 to 5 was to walk through the halls of Congress, making up to 30 deliveries of illegal booze every single day. All the while, Capitol Police just watched. Yeah, he could come and go at any time. In over 5 years, he supplied bottles of whiskey, moonshine, scotch, bourbon, gin, you name it. He'd carry all of this in a briefcase. Yeah, so he couldn't have looked more official with his hat and his briefcase. He's going to work. This guy's 9 to 5. He's busy. His politician friends eventually got him his own room, his own office to work out of in the House office building. In 1925, he was sadly arrested while ferreting 6 quarts of whiskey to a House member. He had with him that day a light green hat on, and from then on, he's been referred to as the man in the green hat. Yeah, he was busted. He was busted that sad day. Damn. Don't snitch. Somebody definitely snitched on him, eh? They're like, green hat, looks like the Riddler. He's got a Pabst Blue Ribbon in his briefcase, get him. Number 8, not an experiment. Okay, hopefully this clears some things up a bit here, but President Herbert Hoover, he never referred to Prohibition as a noble experiment. That's misquoted, that's not the case. That would be an odd thing to experiment, but that's what many believe here. See, growing up, many books and articles on Prohibition have quoted President Herbert Hoover describing Prohibition as a noble experiment, but even Hoover himself had to get in on this game of broken telephone. Clear some things up a bit. That's a bad quote, especially given the lives lost during this time. Everything's got to be not misquoted at all. Hoover himself reminds us, he assures us that he was a supporter of Prohibition, but he actually campaigned for it in 1928. Afterwards, he made a statement at the Republican National Convention saying that our country has deliberately undertaken a great social and economic experiment, noble in motive and far-reaching in purpose. That's the quote. End quote. Boom. But years later, Hoover said he was misunderstood. He says the phrase, a great social experiment, noble in motive, was distorted into one thing. It was distorted into a noble experiment, which of course was not at all what he said or not at all what it was. So quit spreading those lies, all right? Let's end this 1928 mix-up once and for all. 100 years later, we're like, oh, sorry. Number 7, World War I. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Prohibition hadn't taken off quite yet. It was close, but still a few things to sign. What really turned the tides were experts coming out and arguing that the barley being used to brew beer could actually be made into bread to feed American soldiers. And then from that point on, I mean, it's kind of hard to argue that, right? You're like, well, okay, fine then. The war actually allowed some individuals to paint America's German brewing industry as a threat. Yeah, that massive industry. They're like, what are these guys doing? Politicians would label Pabst and Miller as treacherous and menacing, saying there's German enemies right here at home. Yeah, German enemies, and they come in 6-packs. Heads up. Number 6, not every state. We see this now, being a Canadian, at least I see this. We're seeing certain things become legal all of a sudden. And it's weird, especially when just a few hours south from where I am right now, there are thousands and thousands of people being incarcerated for having something that at the same time is legal or decriminalized up here. You know what I'm saying? You get what I'm saying. It's odd, but we saw this happen in Prohibition as well. Many governors at the time refused to throw any money towards enforcing or policing the alcohol ban. Maryland, for example. Okay, Maryland never even enacted an enforcement code in the first place and eventually earned a reputation as the most stubbornly anti-prohibition states in the Union. It's not bad, it's pretty cool. New York followed and repealed its measures in 1923, and then slowly but surely, it all went away. Therefore, cheers. Nice. That first state was like, you know what? No. Number 5, Al Capone's brother. Oh man, sometimes siblings can be the exact same. My brother and I were practically the same person. We love all the same things, same hobbies, same parents, weirdly enough. What a coincidence is that? Al Capone and his brother? Not so close, it seems. A little different. I don't know. On paper, historically, they went like this. Al Capone's oldest brother was a prohibition enforcement agent. Yeah, take that in. Al built a criminal empire built on illegal liquor in Chicago in the 1920s, and Vincenzo, the eldest of the 6 Capone brothers, he had changed his name to Richard Joseph Hart to hide his identity, and after working at the circus for a bit, because why not, Vincenzo settled in Homer, Nebraska in 1922, but eventually he became a special officer, and eventually he was assigned to investigate bootlegging. He's like, do I have to? Come on. After he lost his badge on suspicion of theft, Vincenzo reunited with the Capone family in 1940. He met up with Al again in Miami and started to get in on that family cash, finally. Number 4, the boring 20s. When we think of the roaring 20s, we think champagne everywhere, funny music, people dancing like this, good times, whatever. It wasn't always like that, alright? This wasn't the Great Gatsby, this was the 1920s. And according to a study conducted by Boston University economists in the early 1990s, alcohol consumption actually fell by 70% during the early years of Prohibition. The levels jumped significantly in the late 20s, sure, but even so, they remained 30% lower than their pre-Prohibition levels for years after the 21st Amendment was passed. So it took some time. It took some time for people to, get used to it again, if I can say that. Number 3, still going. So I was talking about how some places, some states, they didn't enforce this experiment while others did. Well, again, even today, some are still on board and some are still in the 1920s, it seems. The fun 20s. Some states maintained a ban on alcohol within their own borders. Even today, they still do it. Yeah, not a fun place to go. Kansas and Oklahoma remained dry until 1948 and 1959, and Mississippi remained alcohol-free until 1966. That's 33 years after the passing of the 21st Amendment. Like, Guy, can we click refresh? There's some new things going on behind the scenes. I'd love a beverage, please. It's been 33 years. I'm so thirsty. To this day, 10 states still contain counties where alcohol sales are still prohibited. Yeah, go find them and click the no tip option. And be like, here you go. Cheers. No receipt for me. I'm good. Number 2, new wine. Okay, fine. You want to ban alcohol? Well, we'll just make it ourselves. We'll use our own feet and stomp on some grapes. I know you do that at some point, so yeah, I'm onto something here. A great amount of low-key small distilleries and breweries continued to operate in secret during Prohibition. But if you weren't operating in the shadows, you had to either shut your doors or find new uses for these massive factories. For example, Busch, they refitted their breweries to make ice cream. And Coors, they went down the pottery and ceramics route. Yeah, can I get a tall boy of mint chocolate? Nice, thanks. Tip option for sure on that one. 2 scoops? Of course. Now I want chocolate, damn. And finally, number 1, Grandpa's medicine. Okay, we'll end on this one. The Volstead Act had a few hidden gems in it, okay? You gotta read very closely. There were some exceptions to the ban on distributing alcohol. Like today, we have medicinal purposes for everything. First, of course, right? The same for alcohol. Oh, alcohol helps my anxiety. Thank you so much. Sacramental wine was still permitted for religious purposes, and drugstores were allowed to sell medicinal whiskey to treat toothaches and the flu. So you already know hundreds of people just randomly showed up, lied about their tooth hurting just to get their drink on. 1 pint of hard liquor every 3 days. Plan accordingly. There you go, good luck. Pick one movie and then just go for it, I guess. Take 3 ounces every hour until stimulated. Got it. Say no more, doc. Thank you. Many speakeasies eventually started to disguise themselves as pharmacies. Meanwhile, actual pharmacies were lost in the dust. Some poor fellow's like, no, my tooth actually hurts, bro. I swear it actually hurts. I'm not like one of those guys. Or am I? I'll never tell.
And we're starting things off at number 10 with the Sultana Explosion. The Sultana Explosion was a major disaster that happened during the American Civil War. On April 27, 1865, the steamboat Sultana, overloaded with Union soldiers recently released from the Confederate prison camps, exploded on the Mississippi River near Memphis, Tennessee. It is one of the deadliest maritime disasters in U.S. history. The ship was designed to carry around 376 passengers, but on this particular day was carrying an estimated 2,100 people, including Union soldiers who had survived the Confederate prison camps like Andersonville. And the boat was overcrowded because the government paid a bonus for every soldier transported home, and the Sultana's owners, eager to, of course, make more money, ignored safety regulations. And the explosion occurred around 2 a.m. when the steam boilers ruptured, causing a massive fire. The disaster claimed the lives of over 1,800 people, many of whom were killed in the explosion, while others drowned or succumbed to injuries and exposure in the cold river waters. The exact cause of the explosion is still uncertain, but it was likely due to a combination of factors, including overcrowding, poor maintenance of the boilers, and the use of low-quality materials in the vessel's construction. Next up, we have the various types of human species. This is something that has always fascinated me. In the very distant past, there wasn't just one or two, but a total of 8 different human species that roamed the earth. These ancient relatives of ours existed at various times and in different parts of the world. Some existed at the same time, though. We Homo sapiens are the only surviving human species today. That's pretty obvious. The history of our family tree, though, pretty diverse. One of our earliest cousins was Homo habilis, who lived in Africa around 2.4 million years ago. They were skilled tool makers, scavengers. Then came Homo erectus. Probably heard of them. They appeared around 2 million years ago, and they were the first to venture out of Africa, spreading to Asia and beyond. Neanderthals, of course, or Homo neanderthalensis, lived in Europe and parts of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They were skilled hunters. They even created art. It's believed we just killed them all off, but some of their DNA actually still lingers in our population to this day, particularly amongst Europeans. Then we had Homo floresiensis, known as also hobbits, who inhabited Indonesia's Flores Island and stood like 3 feet tall. That'd be about, I guess, this. Homo naledi, a recently discovered species in South Africa, and we can't forget, of course, about the mysterious Denisovans, known from DNA extracted from a finger bone. They're an ancestor of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, though. They lived in Africa, Europe, and Asia. And finally, this one here lived in what is now Zambia and Zimbabwe. Number 8, rat kings. This is just really icky. I remember when I first heard about this, I cringed. Just the thought of this is awful. Rat kings are an odd and incredibly eerie phenomenon that has been reported a number of times over the years. So these occurrences involve groups of rats, typically 4 to 8 of them, becoming entangled by their tails, forming this like disturbing rat cluster. Pretty gnarly sight. The exact cause of rat kings is kind of a mystery. Some experts speculate that it happens when rats nest closely together in warm places and their tails become intertwined over time. Others suggest that it could be a result of just chance, of course, or unusual behavior amongst the rats. Rat kings have been reported in various parts of the world: Germany, France, and the United States. Number 7, the Tanganyika laughter epidemic. This one is very strange, similar to the dancing plague. If you watch this channel consistently, you know what that is. The Tanganyika laughter epidemic of 1962 is one of the strangest events in history, and I only just learned about it today. It all began in a remote girls' school in Kashasha, a small village in what is now Tanzania. Started with just 3 students who suddenly burst into uncontrollable fits of laughter, seemingly for no apparent reason. What made this phenomenon especially baffling was how infectious it proved to be. The laughter quickly spread to many of the other students, affecting 95 out of 159 girls at the school. And these episodes of this hysterical laughter varied in duration, lasting anywhere from a few hours to several days. They not only disrupted the normal routine of the school, but also extended to the point the school was actually forced to close its doors. Even more perplexing was the fact that the extensive medical examinations conducted at the time didn't identify any physical or infectious cause behind this odd behavior. And the main theory among experts is that the laughter epidemic was psychogenic, so it stemmed from psychological or emotional factors rather than some physical source. Believed to be a form of mass psychogenic illness, where the power of suggestion played a significant role in triggering and perpetuating the unusual laughter, kind of like that dancing plague. And at number 6, we have the Somerton Man. So this all started when an unidentified man was found dead on Somerton Beach near Adelaide in 1948. In his pocket, authorities discovered a scrap of paper with the words Tamam Shud, meaning ended or finished in Persian. This scrap was traced to a rare book of Persian poetry found in an abandoned car near the beach, which contained a secret code that has still never been deciphered. And there were extensive investigations, but the man's identity still unknown, and the cause of death still unconfirmed. Autopsy results suggested poisoning, but the specific poison used was never identified. And even more strange, all the labels had been removed from his clothing, and there was no identifying marks or documents in his possession. Like with any mysterious case, this one has given rise to a number of theories and speculations: espionage, a secret love affair. But despite amateur detectives and even experts' attempts to crack the case, the mystery of the Somerton Man is still a mystery. We're taught a lot about World War II in school, and rightfully so, but there's a very interesting unit of the Allied forces that you probably weren't taught about: the Ghost Army. During World War II, a highly secretive unit known as the Ghost Army played an interesting strategic role in deceiving the enemy. The unconventional unit was composed of artists, designers, and even actors tasked with creating elaborate deceptions to mislead the Axis forces. They employed a wide range of clever tactics: inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery to create the illusion of this massive military presence where there were actually just a few soldiers. These inflatable props, known as rubber dummies, were so convincing from a distance that they fooled enemy reconnaissance planes. The sound and radio deception were also major components of their operations. They broadcast like fake radio transmissions imitating the sounds of large army movements, complete with phony chatter and like code words. This all misled the enemy about the locations and intentions of Allied forces. And they would also use deceptive camouflage techniques like painting fake vehicle tracks and creating dummy airfields to divert enemy attention away from the actual Allied targets. This unit played a big role in some significant portions of the war, like the Normandy invasion and the Battle of the Bulge, by confusing and distracting the enemy. But a lot of us didn't learn about this in school because the Ghost Army's existence remained top secret for decades after the war, with their efforts only becoming declassified in the 90s. Number 4, the Bassano Vase. The Bassano Vase, or vase, a cursed, spooky tale connected to an old vase from the 15th century. This vase, also known as the Unlucky Vase, has a creepy reputation for causing terrible luck and even death to its owners. The story goes that the vase was made in Italy as a wedding gift, but brought misfortune to the newlywed. Bride died unexpectedly soon after the wedding, and from there, things only got worse for the owners. Accidents, illnesses, and untimely deaths seemed to follow anyone who came into possession of the thing. Even people who just handled it reported bad luck, injuries, and just a general sense of doom surrounding it. And because of all this dark history, the Bassano Vase, or vase, has garnered quite the reputation and has survived through the years, now sitting in an Italian museum. Visitors are warned about its curse, and many find it eerie and unsettling to be around. Next on the list, we have the Devil's Footprints. In February of 1855 in Devon, England, all you English people, you always schooling me on the pronunciation. Is it Devon, Devon? Anyway, a series of mysterious footprints resembling cloven hooves appeared across a vast area of snow-covered terrain spanning roughly 40 to 100 miles. Local residents were unsurprisingly pretty surprised and deeply unsettled by these odd China tracks. Each footprint measured about 4 inches in length, followed a consistent single file pattern as if they were left behind by a two-legged creature with hooves. Now, there's not a lot of solid evidence to sift through with this case, which makes it hard to really take a stance on. It's not like we have photographs of the tracks or anything. Still unknown exactly what caused these tracks. There are tons of theories, of course. Maybe it was just an elaborate hoax, or maybe there was something supernatural going on. Considering when this happened, someone pointed to the devil being the most likely culprit at the time, and, you know, who's to say, right? It could have been Satan. There's also speculation that it could have been caused by some exotic animal, like a kangaroo, somehow made its way over there. There aren't any known records of kangaroos having been in the area at the time, of course. Most likely this was Satan. And at number 2, we have the Flannan Isles Lighthouse disappearance. This revolves around the eerie disappearance of 3 lighthouse keepers on a remote Scottish island in 1900. On one December morning, a passing ship noticed something strange. The lighthouse's signal wasn't lit. When they attempted to make contact via signal rockets and a horn, there was no response. So concerned, they reported the situation to the mainland. A rescue party was dispatched to the island, and upon arrival, they found the lighthouse keeper's quarters in a state of disarray. The beds appeared to have been hastily abandoned. Personal belongings were left behind. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, though. The kitchen table had even been set for a meal. Even stranger, one of the clocks had stopped, and the lighthouse's logbook contained some strange entries. On December 15th, an entry noted severe winds, but the final log entry on December 26th simply read, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." There were searches of the island and its surroundings, but the 3 lighthouse keepers, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, were never found. And coming in at number 1, we have the USS Cyclops. Yes, we have a Bermuda Triangle mystery for you. The disappearance of the USS Cyclops in 1918 is a maritime mystery that has never been solved. This massive US Navy cargo ship with 309 people on board vanished without a trace while traveling in the Bermuda Triangle, a region known for its mysterious ship and plane disappearances, of course. The USS Cyclops was on a routine voyage from Brazil to Baltimore, Maryland, carrying a load of manganese ore, but it never arrived at its destination, and no distress signals or messages were ever received. There was a massive search by both the US Navy and the Coast Guard, but no wreckage or debris from the ship was ever found. The ship that just kind of vanished into thin air. Numerous theories had been proposed to explain the disappearance: storms, structural issues, possible sabotage. Some, of course, believe that the Bermuda Triangle's supposed supernatural properties played a role here, while others suggest the ship may have fallen victim to enemy action. This was during World War I. The USS Cyclops remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in maritime history and the largest loss of life in the history of the United States Navy, not directly involving combat.
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have the Rhode Island vampire. Admittedly, witch and vampire hunts aren't exactly a topic covered in most history classes, but this is truly a pretty crazy story. In the late 1800s, tuberculosis was spreading pretty rapidly in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Vermont. This obviously would have been pretty terrifying for the residents of these places, but things quickly took a very dark turn. Since many of the people who were passing away from this illness appeared very obviously ill with sunken, drained faces, for some reason, the logical response was that people believed that they had been the prey of vampires. There was a family in Exeter, Rhode Island that had multiple people pass away from the illness, so some people believed that someone in this family must be the feeding vampire. They even went as far as to exhume the bodies of some of the deceased family members to make sure that they weren't undead. One of the exhumed bodies had passed away more recently, so her body was in better condition, which people of course took as a sign of her being a vampire. This led to them burning her heart and liver, and then they mixed the ashes with water. This is most definitely a crime today and pretty scary, but to make things even worse, they gave this concoction to other people in the town who had fallen ill as some kind of a cure. Imagine having to drink that and then still having tuberculosis after. Definitely not a good trade-off. In our number 9 spot today, we have India in World War II. It would be shocking to hear of a school not teaching anything about World War II, but it's often that we don't truly get the full scope of what went on. One thing I saw brought up a few times was the role that India played in the war and what they went through. Firstly, if you didn't know, India played a huge part in the Second World War. We normally hear of the large death tolls from the war, such as the 418,000 Americans who died, or the 450,000 people from the UK, which, don't get me wrong, is a huge and terrible number. But it is estimated that 3 million Indian people died in World War II, which is something I have literally never heard of anyone talk about before. India was fighting Japan, which for the record also had an extremely high death toll in this war, on the Eastern Front, and they were fighting Germany on the Western. World War II is a part of our global history, so why don't we talk about it and how it affected all of the countries? In our number 8 spot today, we have the Acadian Expulsion. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far. This is something that happened in my own country, you guys, and I can honestly say this was never taught at the schools I attended. The Acadians were descendants of the 17th and 18th century French settlers who settled in the area that is now the Canadian Maritimes, so New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. In 1730, Acadians had to swear to British authorities that they would remain neutral on any conflict between Britain and France. Basically, one thing led to another, and the governor of Nova Scotia at the time, Charles Lawrence, saw the Acadians as some kind of a threat, and he also wondered why people who weren't from the area were allowed to live on such a beautiful part of the land. Well, isn't that real rich coming from someone who also wasn't from the area? But that is a whole separate conversation. Charles tried to force the Acadians to take an unqualified oath of allegiance to Britain, and when they refused, he imprisoned them and then ordered them to be deported. A man from New England called Charles Morris came up with the disgusting idea to surround the Acadian churches on a Sunday morning and capture as many people as possible while also burning their houses and crops. This whole situation led to approximately 10,000 Acadians being deported, and apparently this whole ordeal had a fatality rate of 53% for the Acadians. This whole thing is honestly pretty disgraceful, and it's just something that we don't talk about. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Iranian Revolution of 1979. On August 19th, 1978, at the Cinema Rex in Abadan, Iran, there were hundreds of people watching a film when 4 men barricaded the doors, doused the cinema in gasoline, and lit the whole thing ablaze. This was a key event that led to the following revolution of 1979, but it truthfully had been building for quite some time, and this obviously wasn't the only event that led to this movement. This revolution was unique in the fact that it lacked a lot of the usual causes, such as a defeat in war, or a gigantic national debt, or an uprising of those in poverty. There is a lot that happened and a lot that went into this revolution, and I truly do not have time to cover in this video even half of it. But this revolution not only toppled Iran's absolute monarch, but it had worldwide political repercussions that are still seen today. In our number 6 spot today, we have Cyrus the Great. It is entirely possible that you may have learned about Cyrus the Great in school, as he was the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, but there is one thing he did that apparently a lot of us didn't know that possibly changed the course of our history. After he took Babylon over, he freed all of the captured slaves in the city and let them go back to their homelands. This included the Hebrews who were captured and enslaved from Judea. This may seem like a nice and reasonable thing to do, but it truly was more than that. By allowing these people to be free and return to their homes and continue practicing their religions, this may have been what has kept some religions alive. Without this move, it is possible that we may not have Judaism, Christianity, or Islam today, and that would have made our entire history very, very different. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Italian Renaissance dark side. When we think of the Italian Renaissance period, it is known for development and the rebirth that it caused, which makes a lot of sense considering the word Renaissance literally means rebirth. But there is one less glamorous and slightly frightening side to this period that isn't widely talked about. Sailors who had been returning from the New World at this point brought something less than lovely back with them, and that was syphilis, which spread through an entire French army. After this, the troops brought what was called the Great Pox to the rest of Europe. Since there was no penicillin or banana medicine back then, the disease spread rapidly and the symptoms were pretty gruesome. It would often happen that a person who had fallen ill would have the skin on their faces essentially be rotting away, which would leave large ulcers. Some people's noses and lips would be pretty much gone, and it happened often that people would sadly pass away from the disease. So basically what we think of as a beautiful time in Europe was both world-changing, but also very scary, and pretty close to a zombie apocalypse. In our number 4 spot today, we have the history of dentures. I suppose this one is less of an event and more of a weird practice, but I just had to include it. I don't have a ton of experience with dentures, but they seem to be a pretty straightforward thing these days, aside from the cost of dental, but things weren't always the way they are today. Instead of dentures being made of fake teeth, before they used to be made with real human teeth, which is absolutely disgusting to me. After the Battle of Waterloo, scavengers went and took the teeth off of the corpses, which is quite a job, and then they sold these teeth to dentists. These dentists would boil the teeth, chop the roots off, and then attach these teeth to ivory base plates and then sell them to the customers. Aside from this being an extremely morally questionable practice in its entirety, it is also just so creepy. In our number 3 spot today, we have telephone cats. If you're a cat person, you might want to skip over this number. In 1929, 2 scientists at Princeton University wanted to conduct an experiment in order to test how auditory nerves perceive sounds. This is obviously extremely important research, but the way they went about this is truly messed up. They took a sedated but alive cat and cut out a part of its brain. They then attached one end of a telephone wire to the cat's auditory nerve and then the other end to a telephone receiver. When one of these scientists spoke into the cat's ear, the other one could hear it on the other end. This is cool, but most definitely not an excuse to do something so inhumane. There were, of course, benefits to this experiment, and it is believed that this may have helped lead to the development of cochlear implants, which is, of course, an incredibly important scientific advancement. The worst part, however, while the cat actually survived this experiment, instead of treating it like a king for the rest of its life like it truly deserved, these scientists instead decided to kill it to see if the experiment would still work on a dead cat. It didn't. In our number 2 spot today, we have the smallpox pandemic. I'm sure at some point or another, most of us learned about smallpox and the epidemic, which is something that we luckily don't really have to worry about much anymore. But one thing a lot of people explained that they didn't know was how badly it devastated indigenous peoples. Europeans who came over to America brought with them a multitude of diseases that they would have had some immunity to, considering it was likely their bodies had encountered it before. But this was not the case for those already living on the land that is now referred to as North America. Indigenous Americans not only had no immunity towards this disease, but also their traditional ways of treating illness may have only exacerbated the symptoms. Because of course, how could you possibly know how to treat something that you've never seen before and with no help from the people who actually do know? It has been estimated that the spread of this disease caused the population of Indigenous Americans to decline by 70%. That is absolutely insane. There's a theory that this spread of disease may have been one of the only things that led to the colonization of North America. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Tulsa Massacre. This is one that many people, including people from Tulsa, explained that they didn't really learn much about in school. This event occurred on May 31st and June 1st of 1921, and it has actually been called the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. This happened in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and basically just mobs of white racist people went out and attacked black residents and businesses. What started this was when a 19-year-old black man named Dick Rowland was accused of harming a 17-year-old white girl, and he was subsequently arrested, and there were rumors that he was going to be lynched. This of course drew a bunch of racist white people out of their homes to participate, but then a group of around 75 black men also showed up to make sure that he didn't get lynched. lynched. One thing led to another, and a firefight broke out that led to 10 of the white people and 2 of the black people being killed. After this, all hell broke loose. Just last year, the last living survivor of the massacre, R&B and jazz saxophonist Hal Singer, passed away at the age of 100. And just last year, this massacre finally became a part of the Oklahoma State curriculum, and it's about time. Only a century too late. I also feel like in that I didn't include, but I should have said, that thing after the lynching was like only the beginning of it, and then everything got crazy and way more people died, and it was really destructive. I just didn't want anyone to think that I was making it seem like it wasn't as bad as it was, because it really was.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have lobotomies. Did you know that it used to be common practice for people to just get a part of their brain cut out? Okay, well maybe not common, but it wasn't as uncommon as you would hope. Lobotomies used to be considered an excellent and efficient cure for things such as mental health problems, which thankfully is a practice that has not survived for a very good reason. Of course, in modern medicine they do still exist, but only when actually necessary, and there is of course a lot more knowledge about the dangers and effects. One well-known person to have undergone one of these procedures was Rosemary Kennedy, who was John F. Kennedy's sister. She was experiencing seizures as well as mood swings, and while the seizures certainly were something that needed to be looked after for her health, I'm not sure if the mood swings necessarily needed some kind of medical intervention. Anyways, to cure her, they had a lobotomy performed on her. This procedure left her with the mental capacity of a 2-year-old, and she could no longer speak or walk properly. After this, she spent most of the rest of her life hidden away, and it was thought that her family did this because they were ashamed of her, which is both horrible and so sad. In our number 9 spot today, we have the English Civil War. This might be something that is taught more often in English schools, but admittedly it's something I didn't even hear mentioned throughout my time in school. This was actually a series of civil wars that took place between 1642 and 1651, and while it is often referred to as one event, it can be divided into 3 separate wars. These wars were mostly in relation to the manner of England's governance as well as pertaining to religious freedoms. The first war was from 1642 to 1646, and the second was from 1648 to 1649. Both the first and second wars saw supporters of King Charles I battling against supporters of the Long Parliament. The third war took place from 1649 until 1651, and this one saw the supporters of King Charles II fighting against the supporters of the Rump Parliament. In the end, these wars saw the execution of King Charles I, the exile of his son King Charles II, and the replacement of the English monarchy with the Commonwealth of England. There's so much more information about what went on and who was fighting in these wars, but I unfortunately don't have time to cover all of it in the short amount of time we have, but it certainly was a revolutionary period for England, Scotland, and Ireland, and it really was concerned with how these 3 kingdoms should be governed. In our number 8 spot today, we have William the Conqueror. This one is a bit more well known than some of the others on this list today, but I want to specifically talk about one thing in reference to this that is much less well known. In 1807, William the Conqueror decided to take on an all-alcohol diet. This is because he was suffering from extreme obesity and was struggling because of that fact. Because of this, he told his staff that he would only drink wine until his weight went down, but he ended up passing away less than a year later, and most of us are told that this was obviously because of the wine-only diet, but that's not actually true. In an astonishing turn of events, this wine-only diet actually worked. Shortly after beginning his diet, he was able to ride his horse again, which was one of the main reasons he started the diet in the first place, as he was previously too heavy for the horse to carry. He actually died after falling from his horse during an expedition, which was completely unrelated to either his weight or his diet. It's entirely possible that had he not gone on this diet, he would have never ridden his horse and maybe would have lived longer. Truthfully, who knows, but I suppose in a very roundabout way, he did still kind of die from this wine-only diet. In our number 7 spot today, we have the World War II dogs. A lot of us have learned quite a bit about World War II, as it affected everyone at the time and was obviously a huge deal. We all have slightly different perspectives on it depending where you grew up and went to school, but it's something that is still widely talked about today. There is so much to cover on this topic, so of course some of it ends up getting left out of the history textbooks, but that doesn't mean the knowledge doesn't survive in some capacity. For today's list, I want to talk about a technique that was used in Russia during World War II that ended up completely backfiring. In Russia, they had trained dogs with bombs strapped onto their backs to run under tanks. I'd like to think that this technique also saw the dog being able to leave the bomb there so that they could escape, but that is most likely wishful thinking, but that isn't even what I wanted to talk about today. While this is, I suppose, a good tactic for fighting a war, there was one grave oversight during this training. All the dogs were of course trained using Russian tanks, since that's where and who they were being trained by, so when it came time for the real deal, these dogs couldn't differentiate between a Russian tank or an enemy tank, which then saw the dogs running under what they knew, which were the Russian tanks. Certainly not the outcome that they were expecting. In our number 6 spot today we have Mary Shelley. We all know Mary Shelley as the author of Frankenstein, but there's one super creepy and kind of sad thing about her that is much less well known. Mary's husband was a man named Percy, and when he was 29 years old he was sailing with 2 other men, and on July 8th, 1822 they got caught up in a storm and ended up drowning. The bodies of the men were found 10 days later, and they were only able to be identified based on their clothing. This of course is extremely tragic and sad, and of course it would have been so awful for Mary to have to lose her husband at all, let alone in this way. Percy ended up being cremated, and for some reason his heart was the only part of his body that refused to burn, which I guess now physicians suggest was due to calcification from an earlier bout with tuberculosis. While this in itself is pretty freaky, at first Percy's friend Lee Hunter ended up keeping his heart, but later it was turned over to Mary. Instead of disposing of the heart or doing anything normal with it, Mary ended up keeping the heart, and she carried it with her for years. No one knew about this odd little keepsake until a year after her death, when it was found in the drawer of her desk, wrapped up in the pages of one of his last poems. What a simultaneously heartbreakingly beautiful, but also ultra creepy story. The heart ended up being buried in the family vault with Percy and Mary's son after he passed away in 1889. In our number 5 spot today we have strange medicine. It's not necessarily uncommon for us to hear about strange things that people in the past used to do, but sometimes those strange things are also disgusting. It was extremely common in the past for people to use human remains as a form of medicine. You'd think at some point they'd realize that these remains truly were doing more harm than good. Well, I guess we did, but it did go on for much longer than it should have. The cannibalistic treatments would consist of things such as blood, ground up human skull, and even human fat. Tomb raiders would even steal remains in order for them to be sold to the wealthy, which is incredibly dark, and apparently mummy remains were the ideal remains for these sorts of things, which led to a shortage of mummies. I never thought I'd be in a position where I'd be talking about a shortage of mummies, but truly anything can happen over here at Most Amazing Top 10. I guess who am I to judge these past decisions, but all I can say is that I am very glad this is one we have moved on from. In our number 4 spot today we have the Chilean Civil War. Just to throw another war into the mix today, let's talk about the Chilean Civil War of 1891. The short of it on this war is that the president at the time, Jose Manuel Balmaceda, tried to give himself a lot more power than he probably should have had. The Congress weren't exactly thrilled about that, so they and the Chilean Navy rebelled against the president and the army. The Navy made the smart move by going north and seizing the nitrate mines, which were very economically important. From there they sailed south. Like any war, there of course was a lot that went on, but ultimately the Navy and Congress were successful and victorious. This war was actually the first war where modern torpedoes were used and were actually successful, although it took all of the torpedoes they had in just one attack. Part of the reason the Navy was so successful in this war because not only were they able to dominate on land, but also sea. This really led other countries to realize how vital it was for them to have modern ships and naval defenses. It also made other countries realize how important it was for them to have modern weapons. This war may be lesser known and less discussed, but it certainly was an eye-opener for a lot of other countries. In our number 3 spot today we have King Gojien of Yue. King Gojien of Yue had his reign from 496 BC until 465 BC. His reign took place during what was arguably the last major conflict of the spring and autumn period, and he was able to lead his state to victory, but it certainly certainly wasn't an easy road or without some very creepy happenings. The major conflict he led his state through was the war between Wu and Yue, which started when a Yue princess, who was married to a prince of Wu, left her husband and fled back to Yue. I mean, this of course wasn't the only thing that caused the war, but it certainly sparked the fire. King Gojian was an extremely humble king, as he wouldn't relish in the riches he had as most royals would. Instead, he ate the same food as peasants and often would leave himself hungry in order to remember that he was in a position to serve his state. Okay, so you might be sitting there wondering when I'm going to get to the scary historical event that you came to this video for, so here it is. As I mentioned before, he was able to lead his state to victory, but of course a war involves a lot of sacrifice and some pretty horrific happenings. King Gojian's army was very well known for their ability to scare their enemies before battle began, and this is because their frontline consisted of criminals who had been sentenced to death. In this time there wasn't lethal injection or the electric chair, so naturally it was a lot more of a vicious process. These criminals would decapitate themselves in front of the enemy army. Yep, I think this is probably the definition of a scary historical event. I can't even imagine witnessing something like that and then having to proceed with a battle against the army that has people doing that sort of thing. King Gojian was certainly not a leader who was wasting time messing around. In our number 2 spot today we have Topsy the elephant. Topsy was a female Asian elephant who was born in Southeast Asia around 1875. She was secretly brought into the United States shortly after and was unfortunately added to a circus who advertised her as the first elephant born in the US, despite that obviously not being true. During her 25 years with this circus, she gained a reputation as a bad elephant, and after she ended up killing a guest at the circus, she was sold to Coney Island's Sea Lion Park in 1902. The Sea Lion Park was eventually sold and renamed to Luna Park, and during Topsy's time here, she was involved in quite a few highly publicized incidents, which could be attributed to her drunken handler, the publicity-hungry owners of the circus, as well as the fact that this is all a perfect example of why animals that belong in the wild should be in the wild. In the end, all of the horrible people who had a hand in Topsy being in this circus decided that since she was such a problem, they would execute her publicly. They were going to hang her, but because people thought that that was inhumane, they decided to take a different route. For the record, I just want to say that the execution of Topsy was inhumane no matter what method they chose, because Topsy didn't deserve to be in this kind of an environment. On January 4th of 1903, Topsy was fed carrots that were laced with potassium cyanide, and she was also electrocuted and strangled. To make this horrific day even worse, the event was both spectated and the Edison Manufacturing Movie Company was there to film the whole thing. Many people believe Thomas Edison was actually there himself, but that is something that is up for debate. This whole situation is absolutely heartbreaking, and Topsy deserved a lot better than everything she had to go through. In our number 1 spot today we have the Red Summer. The Red Summer is something I didn't even hear mentioned in school, which is honestly absolutely shocking. I'm hoping this is something that is more commonly taught than I think it is, because it certainly is very important. The Red Summer is the term used to refer to the period from the late winter through to the early autumn of 1919, in which white supremacist terrorism and racial riots took place in more than 36 cities across America. Some of the more well-known race riots that took place during the Red Summer were the Chicago and Washington, D.C. riots, and the Red Summer also saw the Elaine massacre that took place in Elaine, Arkansas, which saw the deaths of between 100 to 240 black Americans. These anti-black riots are said to have developed from a multitude of post-World War I tensions, such as the economic slump and the competition in job and housing markets. In 1919, it certainly wasn't uncommon for there to be race riots and a multitude of white on black violence, but the Red Summer really marked some of the first race riots in which black people in number stood up to the white supremacy, resisted, and fought back. During the Red Summer, a civil rights activist named A. Philip Randolph publicly defended the right of black people to self-defense. It is said that between January 1st and September 14th of 1919, white mobs lynched at least 43 black Americans, but despite this, the states refused to interfere or prosecute these mobs. Considering how many race riots went on during this summer, we truly could dedicate an entire video to the Red Summer. It is insane to think about how recent 1919 really was, and while we certainly have come a long way, there is always more work to be done, and part of the work involves us learning about these horrible histories and what happened in our past.
Starting us us off at number 10, we have mummy unwrapping parties. So we already know that people love to do all kinds of weird and strange things with mummies back in the day. But after people widely stopped eating them or using their remains to make medicines, a new mummy trend began. After Napoleon's first expedition to Egypt in 1798, Europeans began to become even more enthralled with mummies than they ever had been. In the 19th century, a mummy craze began. Travelers began bringing back whole mummies they had bought off the street in Egypt. And the next thing you know, they were no longer thought of having medicinal purposes, but rather being a wonderful party activity. Soon it became customary to hold mummy unwrapping parties, and wealthy Victorians would gather around as the host slowly unwrapped the dead body, showing off his wealth while simultaneously giving guests a thrilling evening filled with horror and delight. I have no clue what was done with the mummies after the public unboxing, but somehow I almost think it's better, as I'm sure whatever happened next was even more disgusting. Number 9. Bomb shadows. We all likely know and were taught about the devastating bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that killed 226,000 people in 1945. But one thing that you may not have learned about was what those bombs left behind. Apparently, as the attack was happening, the light and heat from the weapon was absorbed by the people and the objects in front of it. The surrounding light and heat then ended up bleaching the areas of the ground where nothing had been, leaving objects and people-shaped marks on the pavement. They became known as the shadows of the dead, and even now, after nearly 80 years, some of the shadows remain stained into the pavement and walls all over the city, as a reminder to the human capacity for destruction. Coming in at number 8, Vlad the Impaler. Born into a royal family in 1431, Vlad III was son of Vlad Dracul, the ruler of Wallachia at the time. During this time, Transylvania faced a lot of battles and bloodshed as the Ottoman Empire kept trying to push west towards Europe, and the Christian Crusaders marched eastward towards the Holy Land. In 1442, Vlad Dracul was called to a diplomatic meeting with the Ottomans and brought with him his sons. But the meeting was a trap, and all three were arrested and held hostage. The father was granted to leave as long as he left his sons behind, and he agreed. So for the next few years, Vlad and his brother were trapped and tortured, although they did also strangely tutor the men in science, philosophy, and art, as well as turn them into warriors. Eventually his brother and father both died, and Vlad was released. Soon after, he became the leader of Wallachia, and when the city of Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, Vlad led the force to defend his land from an invasion. It was during this time he became known as Vlad the Impaler, as he often used metal or wooden poles to impale invaders right through their chest, or sometimes he would even insert it vertically up the victim until it pierced through their shoulders, neck, or mouth. While well respected, he became notorious for killing thousands of people, and eventually became the inspiration for Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Count Dracula. Coming in at number 7, incubators. Nowadays, incubators are seen as life-saving devices for premature newborns, but shockingly, this was not always the attitude towards them. During the early 20th century, most physicians kind of held the belief that premature infants were not meant to survive, and so they were tragically just kind of left to die in most cases. But Martin Cooney held a different belief from his peers and wanted to try and change the narrative. But in order to do so, he had to make it a spectacle. One thing that people loved to do back in the day was gawk at the unusual, laugh at the different, and it's for that very reason that sideshows existed. So in order to save the lives of the preemies, Cooney decided to display them in what he called hatcheries as a sideshow in Coney Island. For a quarter, visitors could gaze upon the peculiar and small young people, and over the years he managed to save more than 6,500 lives by packaging up their safety in a swallowable pill for the times he lived in. After so much success, doctors started coming around his ideas, and now they are used by hospitals around the world. Next up at number 6, Pharaoh Pepi. Although the exact timeline is up for debate, somewhere around 2278 BC to 2216 BC, Pharaoh Pepi II reigned in Egypt. The ruler succeeded the throne at age 6 and became widely known as being one of Egypt's most demanding kings, which comes with little to no surprise that a literal first grader being given the power of a pharaoh affected his ego in a negative way. Often he demanded outlandish tasks of his slaves and subjects, but most strange of all was his practice to keep flies off of him. Apparently he hated flies more than anything in the world, so Pepi would force several slaves a day to be covered head to toe in honey and then stand naked by him in hopes to attract the bugs towards them and off himself. By the end of their days, his slaves would be covered in bites, boils, and sores caused by the countless insects that swarmed to them, and soon they would often succumb to diseases like malaria. Later on, flies actually became more or less a creature of high esteem for the Egyptians, becoming a symbol for persistence and tenacity, but for the near 90-year or so reign under Pepi, they were apparently the worst creature alive. Coming in at number 5, a cat phone. In 1929, a pair of scientists at Princeton University had a question. They wanted to test out how the auditory nerve perceives sound. But in order to test that, they had to find a subject. Now, as you can imagine, not too many people were lining up for this, so they ultimately decided to perform the experiment on a cat. The cat was heavily sedated prior to the operation, where the scientists cut out parts of its brain before attaching one end of a telephone wire into its auditory nerve and the other end into a receiver. Shockingly, the cat survived the operation and the scientists went forward with their experiment. To their delight, they discovered that if you spoke into the cat's ear, you could hear it perfectly through the receiver. But their initial success was not enough for them. Next, they had to know if it worked once the cat was dead. So they killed the cat to test their theory, but sadly the cat phone no longer functioned without access to a functional brain. Despite its rather gruesome story, the two did actually contribute to a valuable understanding of the brain and helped future researchers in development of cochlear implants. So at least it wasn't all in vain. Coming in at number 4, death photography. Memento mori means remember you must die. For centuries, trinkets were used to keep the thought of death close and to help the living through their grieving process. In Victorian times, this looked like lockets filled with hair of the dead, a mask of your loved one created out of wax, or by having paintings and sculptures made in their memory. But all of a sudden, a new invention came along that led to creating an all-new kind of memento mori, the photograph. As its popularity increased, the price of having your photo taken was all of a sudden cheaper than a portrait, and many began using this new technology to keep the essence of their loved ones preserved forever. Next thing you know, families are getting photos taken with their dead family members, and for many, it was even the first time getting a photo taken. The dead were sometimes propped up to look alive, while other times eyeballs were painted on after it developed to give them a more lifelike look. The pictures would be hung in the house just like any normal family portrait and served as a reminder to the family of the ones they lost. Thankfully, the practice went out of style as healthcare began to improve and less people were dying so young. Coming in at number 3, gibbeting. During medieval times, the practice of execution was really just an average Tuesday afternoon, and even darker was that it was pretty common practice for criminals to be left on the gallows after they were hanged, as sort of a warning sign to the others in the town. But another form of torturous death they made criminals endure was called gibbeting. The ancient practice consisted of humiliating and hanging a criminal from a large post, but unlike being hanged, the convict was stuffed inside a small cage that was left dangling in the air. The victim would be put in the cage completely alive and essentially left to rot, while people of the town gathered round to witness the spectacle, often even torturing the criminal in their own ways. Eventually, after starvation, cold, and muscle atrophy, they would die and their rotting bodies would be left inside the hanging cage for weeks, sometimes even years, until nothing but their skeletons remained inside. Eventually, the practice was outlawed by the mid-1800s, but some say that if you walk past an old gibbeting cage, you can still hear the screams of the soul who died inside. Coming in In at number 2, chats with a severed head. In the early 1900s, a French physician named Gabriel Boudieu was interested in exploring the connection between mind, brain, and body. So in 1905, when the execution of Henri Langouis was announced, he rushed to the guillotine to study the aftermath. Boudieu claimed that after the guillotine dropped and the head fell to the ground, he called out to the victim and the severed head allegedly blinked his eyes as if awakening. He wrote, "The eyelids lifted up, this time I swear, in a distinctly normal movement, slow as if awakening or torn from thought." He further detailed that the pupils focused in on him until slowly the eyelids faded closed. But once again, he called the man's name and his eyes opened. Some believe that it was simply leftover nerve impulses, but Gabriel swore that the head could hear him and understand him. He said he felt something looking into his eyes and knew it wasn't just a coincidence. And last up today, the Leningrad famine. For 872 days, the people of Leningrad suffered one of the most destructive military blockades in history. In just a little less than 3 years, the population dropped from 2.5 million to just 800,000. In September of 1941, they were bombarded by the Axis powers and cut off from the outside world, receiving no wood, no gas, no coal, and no food. And it only got worse once winter hit. Soon they were trying to stay alive with no food in negative 40-degree temperatures, and so many resorted to burning their possessions just to evade death one more day. But as time went on, it only got darker and darker. People would leave their homes and never return. At first, many assumed they died in the cold, but suddenly it was happening more and more frequently. It didn't take too long to draw a connection to the mysterious disappearances, as the next day there would magically be meat available at the market, usually labeled as horse or dog. Soon after, people began killing firsthand, just to feed themselves, and some were even driven to kill their own families just to survive. Officially, there are 2,000 recorded cases of eating human flesh, but it's believed to be much higher. All the while, of course, the elite hoarded food that came into the city via the lakes and never once went hungry. There are journal recordings from the same time about eating goose and caviar at a party while the commoners froze to death in the streets. Shall we? Starting us off at number 10 is the Judas Cradle. The medieval times are known for a lot of stuff, and one of those is their insanely gruesome torture devices. Back then, if you'd found out you were facing the guillotine, you could actually breathe a sigh of relief, because trust me, there were far worse ways to die. One of these horrific devices was called a Judas Cradle, and was used to interrogate prospective criminals into talking, and often would result in their death one way or another. Victims that faced this torture would be stripped of their clothing, bound, and then lowered slowly onto a pyramid-shaped spike that, depending on your downstairs parts, would be aimed at different areas, I'll just say. Any movement at all would only make the pain worse, so if you weren't telling them what they wanted to hear, they would often rock the victim back and forth, tearing them further open, and they would keep victims here as long as it took, sometimes even overnight. But what about the death part? Well, if you didn't die from injuries received during the torture, or frankly just blood loss, then most died from infection. You see, the spike was never really cleaned, so there was a whole horde of bacteria and disease that would settle onto the spike, inevitably seeping into the victim's nether regions. How fun, right? Next up at number 9 is cruentation. The Middle Ages had many interesting ways to handle justice, much of which I think we are all incredibly grateful is illegal nowadays. One of these such practices was called cruentation. Essentially, back then they believed that corpses retained a tiny spark of life after death, and so they were therefore revered as magical entities. Just imagining that they saw rigor mortis and decided that the corpse was somehow still alive. But how did this involve their judicial system? Well, with the idea of using the corpse's magical powers to their advantage, they would place an accused killer in contact with the corpse of their alleged victim. And if the corpse started spontaneously bleeding when the convict was in its presence, it was seen as confirmed evidence that they were guilty of the crime. This actually remained a completely legal practice until the late 17th century, but thankfully somewhere down the line they figured out that maybe a dead bleeding body couldn't be used as proof to convict convict someone of killing. Next up at number 8 is slug soup. Listen, I love just about all the creatures on the planet, and I don't have it out for slugs or anything, but I have never been able to look at one without feeling nauseous, so this actually sounds like a personal version of hell to me. During the Crusade battles, Muslims became popular for using aconite to poison the Crusaders. This was obviously causing quite an issue, as at the time there was no known cure. That was until one day when 14th century doctor Guido de Vigevano noticed some slugs munching away on an aconite leaf, and he had the biggest light bulb moment of his career. He collected slugs and boiled them before using the boiled sludge and turning it into a soup. First he tested it on animals, and after successful results there, he decided to try it out for himself. After a bit of trial and error, it turned out to make quite a successful antidote to the poison. But man oh man, does it sound incredibly disgusting. But still, better than being poisoned, I guess. Coming in at number 7 are transy tombs. In the Middle Ages, the practice of memento mori, meaning remember you must die, was huge. Memento mori was practiced in many ways: open caskets, churches filled with skeletons of the dead, and years later developed into things like photographing the dead. Their keen attachment to this philosophy likely stemmed from the sheer amount of people dying so frequently due to the overall lack of hygiene, so they had to come to terms with death in a much more peaceful sense than maybe we do now. One of their favorite ways to practice memento mori, however, was with transy tombs, which were funerary monuments that depicted the deceased in a stage of eerie decomposition. As you can imagine, they were costly, so usually they could only be resurrected after those with high standing or a small fortune in the bank. At the time, there was an existing belief that the earthly body was merely a transition vessel of the soul, and that after death the spirit would be resurrected. And so in creating these tombs that resembled the decomposing dead, they figured it would help the soul move on more quickly. And while I'm not opposed to all of the reasons behind it, from the modern lens, it is a bit morbid to have statues not only resembling the dead, but looking like zombies lining the streets, and I'm just glad this practice went out of fashion. Coming in at number 6 is bloodletting. Back in the day, the medical practice of bloodletting was used by medieval physicians as they believed it would literally let the bad blood out of the body. This belief is mostly derived from the Greek physician Hippocrates and his theory of the 4 humors. The 4 humoral theory centered around the belief that inside the body there are 4 main humors or liquids: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm, and that any imbalance in these liquids was what caused health issues or even changes in temperament. So where bloodletting came in was that there was this belief you could let out blood in order to balance out these liquids in your body again. Now, while this theory was definitely a stepping stone in modern medicine, many argue could be considered a precursor to blood transfusions, the way that it was being done was without any real scientific backing, and without any understanding of just how much blood was safe to let out or from what vein or artery was the safest. For example, people were so into the practice at the time that they would base which day was best for bloodletting on texts, usually advising to pick a saint's day. It was also popular to rely on charts showing which parts of the body were best to bleed from according to their zodiac. So as you can imagine, the practice did not always end well. Coming in at number 5 is Saint Francesca Romana. During medieval times, fornication in any other context than between a man and his wife, and for the purposes of procreation, was considered a sin, punishable by life in prison. Now, of course, there were many people that did not take this to heart, but there was one woman who very much did: Francesca Romana. For as long as Romana could recall, she always wanted to become a nun when she got older, but as happened all too frequently back then, her father forced her into marriage at the age of 13 as the man in question was extremely wealthy. At first she was incredibly reluctant, but after she allegedly received a vision from Saint Alexis, she changed her tune and became a dutiful wife, and even perhaps grew to like her husband. But this didn't change Romana's belief about the sins revolving what went on in the marital bed, so in private, wishing to remain spiritually chaste even if she couldn't be in her physical body, she would heat pork fat and burn her nether regions to ensure that she would remain in extreme pain throughout the act and never enjoy a minute of it. This was the only way she believed she could commit the act without sin and remain in the good graces with God. Coming in at number 4 is an arthritis cure. This one actually blew my mind when I first came across it. According to an 1896 news story in the Smithsonian, one day a drunk man was on a beach with some of his friends when he spotted a rotting whale carcass. Because he was drunk, he thought it'd be super funny to dive right into it. And he did. His friends waited for him and finally he came out, but he reported something incredibly strange. That his rheumatoid arthritis was seemingly gone. This sparked a national craze in Australia, and once word got out about the healing powers of the whale carcass, the town of Eden became a worldwide destination for people suffering from the condition. Visitors would be lowered into a freshly dead whale through a hole which would be sewn up, and it was advertised that if the person could stay inside for 20 to 30 hours, they would be cured of their pain. I have to imagine that you would need to be in so much pain to give this a try in the first place, because the thought of spending an entire day inside of a dead whale just seems wild. That being said, it's not all a bunch of hogwash. There is reason to believe that the rotting whale would have acted like a sweat box of sorts, potentially relieving some of the pain, but truthfully, I don't see how this could cause any kind of permanent fix. Let's just be grateful there are some other options out there today. Coming in at number 3 is a brutal execution. As has already been established, one of medieval Europe's most notorious strengths was figuring out the most gruesome way to either torture or kill their citizens. And if you thought that the Judas Cradle was bad, then wait until you hear about this one. To be hanged, drawn, and quartered was a method of execution far worse than any other. At least with practices like the guillotine, it's over quickly enough, but with this one, it was quite literally drawn out just to make you suffer. First off, the victim would be tied to a wooden panel and dragged, or drawn, behind a horse to their place of execution. Second, they would be hanged until the point right before they died. Then they would mutilate the body, often by disembowelment or emasculating it, while they were still alive before finally beheading them and quartering the body, meaning cutting it into 4 pieces. It was intentionally excessive, as this was a punishment saved for those who committed high treason against the king and was used to instill compliance and fear in the onlookers. It was most popular in 14th century England, although it remained in the rotation of choices until it was abolished in 1870. Coming in at number 2 are changelings. Across Europe, there was an old belief in changelings, which were thought to be evil creatures left in place of young ones stolen by fairies. This was a huge problem for many reasons. Number 1, it was objectively not happening. You see, the main reason that parents believed their little ones had been swapped with a changeling was that their young ones suddenly fell ill, had physical deformities, behavioral changes like advanced knowledge beyond their years, or being mischievous. So essentially, if the young person in question got sick, became intelligent, had a disability, or acted like a normal developing person in any way, it was viewed as a changeling. Tragically, once it was believed that a changeling imposter was in their arms, there was only one way to handle the situation. Hurt it in hopes that the fairies would come save the changeling and they would give their real one back. They did things like exorcisms, leaving them in the cold, poisoning them, or even trying to end their lives. And they believed that in doing this, their real little one would be returned to them. It may just be one of the saddest and most cruel practices to have ever existed. And last up, in our number 1 spot, are Ivy League photos. If you thought there was corruption in the high-ranking areas of society before this, then buckle up, because this one might be one of the most insane things I've ever heard. Apparently, for some time, it was actually required for students enrolling in Ivy League schools to have their photos taken in a grotesquely inappropriate fashion. To put it delicately, you were not allowed to be dressed. This dark underbelly came to light in the 1970s when a Yale employee opened a long, locked room and discovered thousands of photos dating back several decades. It was then uncovered that between the 40s to the 60s, it was a requirement to submit what they called posture photos, which were taken from every single angle and forced the subjects to attach pins to their spines under the guise of studying their spines. Some schools, however, practiced longer. Harvard, for example, began in the 1880s and got away with it until the 20th century. Of course, there was a huge investigation about this, and they found that the photos were used in various studies for big tobacco, or that they would use them in books for illustrations, but the creepiest was a professor that admitted the photos were used for anthropological research and were used to study the connection between a student's body type and their intelligence, in what was basically glorified eugenics. Thankfully, most of these photos have since been burned. However, for some reason there are some that remain at the Smithsonian. I'm just grateful the practice of mandatory nude photos is banned, cause actually what the heck is that?